Right, okay. Well, hello, good evening and welcome to our first virtual whiskey tasting of 2021. It's not too late, I think, to wish you all a belated Happy New Year. And I trust that given the lockdown situation, some of you have still got your Christmas decorations up. It's perfectly permissible to do that until Candlemas, which is on the 2nd of February. So you've got another week or so to enjoy Christmas decorations if without guilt if you still haven't taken them down. So I'm very pleased to welcome all of you as guests to our virtual Burns Night whiskey tasting. And in particular, I'm delighted to welcome Callum Fraser, who's a spirit specialist with W.G. Grunt. So he's going to be sharing some of the onerous task of tasting some very nice Scotch whiskies this evening and giving us the benefit of his wisdom and knowledge as a spirit specialist with a particular interest in innovation and some of the new and exciting techniques and products that are being developed. So first of all, for those of you who've not been on one of our tastings before, and as a refresher for those who have, let me give you a little bit of background about Nichols and Perks. This is a firm that's set in the centre of Stourbridge, which is a town about 12 miles west of Birmingham. And it was established in 1797. It's an independent family-owned business. It's currently fourth generation family owned, and the same family has been in possession of the firm since 1945. As well as serving our local retail community, we go far and wide with our deliveries, and last year we delivered to about 50 different countries. And hopefully, Brexit permitting, we will continue to do that over the next few years. As far as whiskies are concerned, we carry a stock of about 2,500 different whiskies, which is quite a considerable choice, anything from price points of less than £20 up to many tens of thousands of pounds, such as the rarefied and exotic market at the other end. Well, we're not going to be tasting anything quite that expensive, but we've got some really nice whiskies this evening, more of which in a short wee while. So as well as the retail, we supply the on-trade, Michelin-star restaurants, hotels. Last year, we had a phone call one Saturday, and it was a very famous golf course up in Scotland, and they needed a very expensive whiskey that we had to celebrate somebody's birthday that was tied to a specific year. And they paid for a courier to drive it up on the same day, all the way up to St Andrews. So we do get some interesting requests.
I was worried you were going to say the T word there.
No. Certainly not. Certainly not. He's actually going to be persona non grata, I understand, in some of the golf courses around the place.
Yes, but he got explicitly told not to turn up on inauguration day to Scotland. The local airport to Turnberry is the same local airport to Gurdon for our distillery. So they were expecting an American incoming flight, specifically chartered, and yes, well, our First Minister told him not to bother.
My admiration for the Scots has grown even more with that piece of news. Okay, so as well as all these other things, we do inbound storage, broking, cellar planning, and events. We do about 100 events over a course of a year, and this one is all about whiskey. So before we actually get down to it, let's give you a little bit of background. So the ideal sort of glass, this is a Glencairn tasting glass. It's very, very popular. Anything that's got a kind of slightly bulbous bowl there, which allows the air to interact with the whiskey and then funnels it very slightly up to the top to gather all those lovely aromatic congeners, so you get this spectrum of flavors, is good. So the best way is to give it a little swirl, not too much, but just to agitate it gently to get some of these complex molecules a little bit kind of warmed up and ready to work their way up into the atmosphere. And then if you tip your glass very slightly at an angle like this and inhale gently, partly through your mouth, partly through your nose, like that, as you draw it past, you'll tend to find that the spectrum of flavors will kind of fan out a little bit more, and it's a little bit easier to differentiate and find more and more flavors as you do that. As you probably know, you get most information through your nose. You've got this wonderful thing called the olfactory bulb, which sits roughly between your sinus and your brain, and is a database of thousands and thousands of different flavors and aromas. And that means that you want to kind of stimulate that with all these little aromatic, slightly volatile compounds, which carry all these wonderful flavors, and which is why we so enjoy exploring them. So the other thing that's good to say is it's okay to add water. In fact, there's some technical reasons why it's a very good idea to add maybe a little touch of water. What we tend to do is to try whiskey neat first of all, and then add literally just a couple of drops of water. You can use it either with a pipette or with a tiny little teaspoon if you don't want to over pour from a jug. And it really doesn't need more than that to change subtly the properties of the whiskey as you're going to taste it. The alcohol and water, once they combine, you get a little bit of energy released, and so the liquid temperature will just pop up very slightly because that's an exothermic reaction, and that allows the whiskey itself to open up a little bit and release more of these volatile aromas. And by reducing the slightly higher alcohol strength, it enables our sense of smell to work better. If you sniff too hard and too close, you will anesthetize your nose, and then you'll make your eyes water, but you won't be able to get much information. So it's good to do this little trick with water. And paradoxically, the aromas sometimes increase in intensity when you first add a few drops of water. So that's always an interesting experiment to do. Different whiskies behave in different ways. So the other thing that adding a little drop of water will do is to create a slightly cooling effect on your tongue, and that makes us more receptive to the salty and fruitier tastes rather than the sweet and spicy. So you can find that adding a little bit of water will even change the flavor profiles of the whiskey. So it's always up to you to do what you feel good with and what you enjoy, but don't let anyone tell you that you shouldn't add water to whiskey. Okay, so a few basic facts about Scotch whiskey. Currently, about 42 bottles of Scotch whiskey are shipped from Scotland every second. The market worldwide is now 175 countries or thereabouts. It's if you laid every bottle sold in a year end to end, they would stretch roughly 90% of the way to the moon. And it's a significant earner for the Exchequer, worth about £4.9 billion last year. And it accounts for about 3/4 of Scottish food and drink exports. So there's a lot of significant numbers in Scotch whisky. So what I'd like to do now is to ask you a little question. So how many operating Scotch whisky distilleries were recorded in 2020? Was it 111, 116, 122, 126, 133, or 139? Don't be shy. There are no prizes for this, by the way. It's just a little bit of fun to make sure that you're still paying attention.
I do like that we're in 175 countries worldwide. Still a few. We'll get the last one.
There's got to be one or two that where the reps haven't quite managed to get there. But I mean, that's a significant and impressive piece of data, I think. Okay, I'm going to count this down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the most popular answer was 126. Well, it's increased slightly from that because, in fact, last year, 133 Scotch whisky distilleries were operational. Okay, so let's move on now. Tonight, as we know, is in celebration of the Robbie Burns. I think I'm going to get Callum to read some of the poetry shortly. There's a great quote. There are two things a Highlander likes naked, and one of them is malt whisky. That's a Scottish proverb. The story of Scotch whisky goes back to around the 15th century. The earliest documented record of distilling in Scotland listed 8 barrels of malt to Friar John Core to make aqua vitae. At that time, a lot of the stills that were running were of course illicit, and they were escaping the taxman. The increasing popularity of Scotch attracted the attention of the Scottish Parliament, looking to try and make some sort of profit from the industry. And the first taxes were introduced in the 17th century in 1644, and that did nothing for the exchequer. It just led to an increase in the illicit whisky distilling across Scotland. So smuggling became standard practice for the next 150 years or so. And there became a cat and mouse between the excise men as they tried to track down the illicit stills. But you imagine the geography of Scotland and the rather spread out land there, you've got no chance of finding all these stills. At one time, they thought there were about 14,000 illicit stills scattered hither and thither around the country. It
is the reason why there's still such a concentrate of distilleries in the northeast. Because the excise men would come up from London or Edinburgh, and they would come north, and people would see them en route. People would know they were coming, and essentially all the distilleries would mothball, and they'd come up and they'd say, "How much whiskey have you produced this year?" And they go, "Oh, none. Can't make money out of whiskey." And so they'd mothball it for a month, and then the other 11 months a year, making hay or making whiskey. But it's kind of the reason that there is a certain geographical difference. Not only that there's a large amount in the northeast, but the fact that we regionalised Scottish whisky, which I know we're gonna talk about, because there was a lesser tax for distilleries in the lowlands, because it was easier for the excise men to get to. So it was to encourage people to build distilleries in the lowlands. Of course, Scots, being tight as we are, decided, well, I'd rather pay no tax than less tax. So, yes, they all ran up to the northeast, where there's plenty of places to hide and plenty of distance between the capitals and the distilleries.
Fantastic. It's a wonderful mixture of the sort of romance and ingenuity to find a way of evading tax. Well, of course, Robert Burns himself was in fact a tax collector. That's what he trained as an excise man before turning his attention to poetry and other pursuits, more of which a little bit later. So bringing it a bit more up to date then, it was the Duke of Gordon who had a lot of land, some of which was producing really good but illicit whiskey. So he proposed to the House of Lords that the government should make it profitable to produce whiskey legally. So that resulted in the Excise Act of 1823, which sanctioned the distilling of whiskey in return for a licence fee of £10 and a set payment per gallon of proof spirit. And that kind of put the kibosh on most of the smuggling, although no doubt there's still a few tales of misdemeanors and things that were going on. So I'm now going to hand over to Callum, and because we are going to address the haggis, and I think Callum is far better qualified than I to do that. So Callum, would you like to kick off proceedings?
I'll tell you now, my whiskey's better than my poetry. Fair fire, honest, sonsy faced, great chieftain of the Puddin race. Upon them ye rank, upon them aye ye tak your place. Haunch, tripe, or thream, wheel are ye wordy, o grace, as lang as mair. The groaning trencher there ye fill, your hardies like a distant hill. Your pin would help to mend a mill in time o' need, while thou pours the dews distill like amber bead.
Fantastic. Round of applause to that man. Okay, well done, Callum. as the entire poem in one sitting would be possibly as indigestible as an overcooked haggis, we're going to break that down into 4 perfectly formed parts as we go through this evening. So before we actually start tasting the very first sample, let's have a look at the different Scotch whisky regions. There are 5 according to the Scotch whisky regulations, and these are Highland, which is represented by the sort of greenish hue there, and that's the largest geographical area of the Scotch whisky regions, and encompasses all the islands except for one, and understandably covers the broadest range of styles, from very sort of fruity floral styles right the way through to rich and peaty and everything in between. Then we've got the lowland, which is indicated by this kind of blue area here. That is a line drawn roughly from just beyond Edinburgh across to Glasgow and everything down to the borders. And then we have Speyside, which Callum mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, where there's a terrific concentration of distilleries. And of course, we've got the River Spey, which provides the fastest flowing river in Scotland, and lots of super quality water for the whisky. Then we've got in the Inner Hebrides, Islay, as a unique category all to itself, mostly but not exclusively smoky and peaty whiskies. And then coming back down, we've got Campbelltown, which is on that peninsula. So let's have a look at our first whisky. This is Deanston, and this is a distillery that is technically a Highland distillery. It was established in 1785 as a cotton mill, and designed by one of the fathers of the Industrial Revolution, Richard Arkwright. It was an innovative place. They had some tremendous water wheels and machinery in there, and they were the largest in Europe at the time. The wheels were named Samson and Hercules, and they were about 36 feet high. It's actually located near Doon in Perthshire. So it's a Highland whisky, but only just. As you can see there, there's Perth and there's the distillery located there. So it's technically Highland, but only just. So if you haven't already, pour yourself a little sample, give it that little swirl and a sniff, and start tasting. Use the chat facility, guys, by the way. We want your comments. We want to let us know what you're tasting, what you're sipping.
So I should probably confess to everyone, I sat and made sort of tasting notes on these yesterday, so I've had a little sample of everything. Now, I don't know if it'll be the same for you, but when I first poured the Deanston, it was quite sulphury almost. It was quite grassy on the nose, and it really sort of developed over time. Now, I've poured this a little bit earlier tonight, and that's all sort of dissipated. All those notes have dissipated, and I get real lovely sort of honey notes straight off the bat.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and I think we were chatting earlier on, Callum, about this one, and doing that little trick of tasting it neat first, and then having a kind of a reset of the palate, just putting a couple of drops of water in. It does change it, and actually I found that adding the water to this one made it very slightly sharper. Mm-hmm. Mm. Which was kind of counterintuitive, but you do get this strange chemistry occurring where some of the congeners are either more or less soluble with the addition of the water, and will change their kind of prevalence in the whiskey itself, in the liquid.
Yeah, you get alcohol soluble molecules and water soluble molecules.
Yeah,
and yeah, you can sort of play about with the construction of your whiskey in glass.
It all gets very complicated, but it's good to enjoy. So, what flavors did you get?
So with a little bit of water, and as we mentioned it earlier, there's a citrus coming through. There's simply lemon, along with like a whole wave of pastry.
Mm.
It's very fresh. I think I said to you earlier, it's 15 years. For me, it drinks a little bit younger, but that's not a bad thing. I mean, some of my favorite whiskey, if you start talking to me about something like the Balvenie range, I don't care for the Balvenie 17, but the 14, the 12 are some of my favorite malts in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you can just sort of get that construction different. I'm a mad, so I like spirits across the board. I really like mezcal. Mezcal kind of reminds me of quite young whiskey. So to say it's a younger sort of style doesn't necessarily mean it.
Yeah, that can be quite fiery, of course, and very earthy. But it's that youthful exuberance, which obviously is part of your personality, Callum. So give us some comments, guys. How are you finding this one? Use that chat facility to send us a message.
There's a bit of spice here on the tongue and on the finish.
Mm.
And I think we talked about there's some virgin oak in there.
Yeah, they've also recharred, shaved, toasted, and recharred some barrels, and that will bring a new lease of life into the barrels, won't it?
Yeah, you're going to get more of that sort of raw. If anybody knows sort of rye whiskey from America, that's when we talk about spice and whiskey, that's always the archetype that I go to. Like if you've ever had a solid like only rye whiskey, that's one extreme end of spice. But it's those sort of notes you're looking for. You're not specifically looking for nutmeg flavors, although it's like those things will be in there. It's that sort of almost white peppery notes on your tongue, and that sort of develops into all those like lovely cinnamon, and that comes from the sort of virgin oak.
Yeah, well, Samuel has said peppery at the back end. I presume he's referring to the whiskey, but that's I think there's an agreement there.
Yeah.
David likes it better with some water, and Terry's saying really nice and fresh. Agree with the grassy comments. Jolien has said mellowed with a drop of water, less peppery. So yeah, I agree. It doesn't taste like a 15-year-old whiskey, does it? In some ways, it does taste more youthful.
It is a lovely drop though.
And again, it's a fairly limited edition. It's only 3,000 bottles that were released for this one. So it's an interesting expression. As the notes that you guys have got says, it's all 100% organic barley from local farms in the South Highlands, quite close to the distillery. So it's very much local materials to produce this one.
I mean, I know everybody's on mute anyway, but there's definitely a sense of quiet satisfaction on that.
Yeah. So David is saying that you're eating it with haggis and there's lemon in the flavour. Yeah, that's interesting. I think food will always bring out and open up some of the other flavours, and if there's something in your haggis meal that resonates with something in the whiskey. So I hope that some of you guys have got some nibbles, whether you're going the whole haggis neeps and tatties thing, or whether you've got a few selected nibbles or a bit of both to experiment with the flavors, because just as adding water to whiskey changes it very subtly but noticeably, so it will when you're eating things and when you're pairing it with, whether it's chocolate or whether it's something savory or salty, or with pastries or dessert or steak or something smoky. All these different foods have got their own congeners and constituents which will react with other flavors. So it's great. You can have great fun with this. Good. Okay. So yeah, and Valerie and Neil say you're enjoying the honey, which is reduced with water. So you guys prefer it without the water. So again, everyone's different. So we will, between us, we'll give you a few pointers from what we notice, and what the whiskey makers say. But of course, it's your own palate which you must trust, as you have your own truth. Okay, so whilst you're hopefully continuing to enjoy that, let's have a little look at Water of Life, or Whisky Baha. Have I said that correctly, Callum?
Whisky.
Whisky B. That's better. that's more elegant. So as we mentioned, there's a heritage stretching back well over 500 years. The term Whisky Bay was abbreviated to whiskey sometime in the 17th century, and by the late or early 1700s, it was known as whiskey. So it's got to be produced at a distillery in Scotland from water malted barley, and it's got to be processed at that distillery into a mash, converted to a fermentable substrate only by enzymes, and fermented at distillery only by adding yeast, and distilled at an alcoholic strength of less than 94.8%, wholly matured in an excise warehouse in Scotland in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 litres. And these are rules from the Scotch whisky regulations from 2009. There's only one other added substance that you can add other than water, and that is a little bit of caramel colouring, although most of the whiskies, if not all of them this evening, will not have that. So I thought it'd be fun for us to quickly have a look at the different steps of production of whiskey. So Callum, do feel free to jump in on this. I don't want to drop you in it, but if you want to tell us a little bit about malting.
So malting is quite essential. Quite simply, you're trying to you have your cereal, your grain, and it's hard, and there's all this energy inside it, and we're looking to gain access to it. So you basically trick it into thinking it's spring, and so you warm it up slightly. This used to be done traditionally on the malt floor. Now it's generally done sort of in big industrial warehouses. Only a few that actually do it now. Balvenie in our portfolio still has a malting floor at the distillery, but it can only handle a very, very, very small fraction of the whiskey that we output. And yeah, you're just looking to germinate it, was the word I was looking for. Germinate it very, very slightly, trick it into thinking it's summer, open up and start that process of expending energy.
Good, thank you. Somebody's just asked, should we wash out the glass after each whiskey? Short answer is yeah, it's probably a good idea if you've got the facility to give that a little bit of a rinse, and also take a sip of water to kind of reset your palate as well. The next step is mashing. Is that the malting has got to be arrested to stop it from continuing to germinate. So that's traditionally where peat was used to power the kiln. And it's at that point where the type of peat and the length of drying under the influence of peat smoke can influence the flavour of the final spirit. So we've now got malt. So next we've got mashing, where the ground down malt, which is the grist, you've heard that expression, adding grist to the mill, is now added to warm water to begin the extraction of the soluble sugars. You need to get fermentable sugars out of the system. So this is this part of the process. That's why most distilleries are next to a good water source, either a big lake, or in the case of most of the Scottish distilleries, a river. The character of the water can influence the final spirit, as it contains minerals from passing over or through either granite or peat or other substrates. So the liquid combination of the malt and the water is then called a mash. And then it's put into a large vessel called a mash tun, and it's stirred around for several hours. During that process, the sugars dissolve, and these are then drawn off through the bottom of the mash tun, and the resulting liquid then is called a wort, and that is normally carried out 3 times to make sure you've got the maximum extraction of those fermentable sugars. Each time you go around again, you put the temperature up a wee bit more to increase that extraction of sugar. Usually you only find that water from the first 2 passes is used, the third lot is put back into the next batch of the new grist, and any residual substance is called the draff, and that's collected and nothing goes to waste in Scotland. They use that in the production of farm feed. So Cal, would you like to talk about fermentation?
Yeah, well, so the fermentation, essentially you're making a beer. Any distillate alcohol starts with a low ABV product and creates a high ABV product by specifically taking off the alcohol. So when you're making whiskey, you make a beer first. If you're making brandy, you essentially make a wine first. And yeah, that is not a particularly exciting sort of process, but your fermentation will generally take your ABV of a beer up to, I think, of the mash up to, I think, about 11%. And yeah, and then you distill from there. So yeah, the fermentation can take sort of anywhere up to I think sort of 9-10 hours. But yeah, nothing particularly sort of exciting going on there. You're dealing with living organisms. You're dealing with yeast, so it's got to stay at a fairly consistent temperature. But that's why we use it. When you were talking about the draft as well, a lot of distilleries now are moving away from cattle feed and putting it, changing that back into usable energy, and making themselves essentially self-sufficient. And that's going to be the way that the distilleries go over the next sort of 15 to 20 years, I would imagine. Some of your leading distilleries are already zero emissions and zero energy consumption, because we're putting everything back into the grid.
That's an interesting and good point to make, Cal, because I think obviously a lot of industries are conscious, particularly those that use a lot of energy, which clearly distillation, the production of whiskey has a large energy requirement. So if you're able to get that energy subsidized by natural byproducts and being able to use those, then that obviously makes a lot of sense economically and environmentally. So the next process is distillation. Most Scottish whiskies are distilled twice. In Ireland, many of the whiskies are distilled 3 times, although there are a few exceptions in both Scotland and Ireland. So if we're talking primarily double distillation, the stills are made from copper, and that's been found to be the best material for extracting impurities from the spirit as it's being distilled. And you find that sulfur reacts with copper. You want to get rid of sulfur as you're distilling, and a lot of stills will have kind of patches of new copper which are put in because it's basically a wasting process, a wasting reaction, and the sulfur will kind of basically combine with the copper and reduce the mass of copper in the still that is left there. So you have to kind of patch them up every so often, and the master distillers are always keen to try and replicate every dent and every fault that's been there for some years, because they are certain that will affect the final outcome of the distillation process. So you've got this large bowl shape at the bottom which rises up to a neck at the top, and then you apply heat. Some taller stills with longer necks will give a finer, lighter spirit, while shorter, fatter stills will tend to produce a fuller and richer spirit. So this is down to the character of the distillery itself and what they're trying to produce. Usually you get 2 stills working in pairs. The wash goes into the bigger wash still, and then that's heated, originally by coal, but largely by gas or steam these days. The liquid then vaporizes and rises up into the still until it reaches the neck, and then it condenses, where the liquid is now called the low wines, which is basically unusable in that state. Then it's passed to a smaller still, and that's the spirit still, and then the alcohol from that comes off at a higher alcoholic concentration. The alcohols from the very beginning of that process are called the foreshots. They're very high in alcohol, very pungent. Alcohols from the other end of the process are called the feints, and they tend to be weak but also pungent. So it's only the alcohol from the middle bit, or the heart of the distillation, that is what we want to keep for production of whiskey. And that's the stillman's job, to make sure he gets that timing right, and then that will be collected through the spirit safe. The foreshots and the feints will then be mixed with the next batch for distillation, but it's the heart of the spirit is then taken to be matured, and that will become eventually whiskey. And the maturation process is back to you, Cal, if you want to tell us a bit about oak.
So yeah, everything has to be in oak. And it's interesting that you mentioned that the regulations you had, I think, were from 2009.
Mm-hmm.
So the regulations are looked at frequently, and have various input from various interested parties. The idea of them having to be on one site, the distillery having to be on one site, and the whiskey aged in oak will always be entrenched. But you will see sort of various ways to finish whiskey. You'll probably all be aware of, it's like a sherry finished whiskey. And generally, that's Oloroso that we use. So casks that previously held Oloroso sherry, and that brings in sort of lots of lovely red fruit flavors. It should be mentioned, the fermentation process is the only process other than the aging process where we can actually input flavors in terms of, or create flavors. Everything in whiskey, all the flavor in whiskey will come from that fermentation, will come from the cereal, come from the yeast, will come from how you treat that. You can't impart a flavor through distillation, you can only extract it. So all the flavor that you're going to get there from your malt is going to be from that fermentation, then distilled, and then you can sort of play around with that in maturation. So we either use spent American oak, or, as I said, this previously used sherry. But recently, there's a little bit of a change. There's always things you could sort of play around with. I'll reference back to Balvenie again. We have a Caribbean cask and have done for a number of years, where we used former rum casks. Now that was an easy thing to sell, or that was an easy thing to justify in the whiskey industry. It's probably been grandfathered in as a law because Scotland has a big history with rum importing. We've had something like OBD blended in Scotland since the 1830s. So there's always going to have these casks been around. So we could finish in rum casks quite justifiably. But just a couple of years ago, we changed the regulations, so you can now age in tequila casks and mezcal casks, and you will start to see distilleries producing whiskies finished in these. Generally, it'll be most of the time in American oak, or our whiskey will spend most of its life in American oak, which has had bourbon in it once and then brought across to Scotland. The reason that this is the case is in the regulations for American whiskey and bourbon and such. It's legal that it's in law that you can only use a barrel once, and that goes back to the days when the government were essentially in the pocket of the mafia. And the mafia owned the lumber mills. Yeah. The mafia knew if they could get this law passed, they would have a constant supply for their lumber and a constant way to launder their money. So bourbon, and that's it. It's a traditional reason that bourbon only uses a cask once, and we know in the whiskey industry we can use it 2 or 3 times, and then it's probably spent. But still, that's sort of if the bourbon's been in there for 6, 7, 8 years, and then we can get maybe another 10, 20, 30 years out of it. So that extends life out of it greatly. And you will see this either virgin oak first fill or second fill, and that's just what that means. And the more times you have something in the barrel, the less flavour you're going to extract from it. So as I said, as mentioned, the Deanstown virgin oak is going to give you loads and loads of flavour, but like really harsh, or if you leave it in too long, it's going to be really harsh, it's going to be really, really spicy. Whereas, so like your sweet spot is kind of that first fill American, and that's why whiskies will generally spend most of their life in there. And then for a finishing cask, so a sherry cask, it's probably only going to spend between 6 months and a couple of years in there. Some whiskies will be entirely sherry cask. You do get that on occasion, but generally it's just a finish, and it's between 6 months and a couple of years.
Great. Okay, I think it's time for the next whiskey, which is Glen Scotia Victoriana. So pour yourself a sample if you haven't already done so. Give it that little swirl and a nose.
So I have some fun tasting notes for this. Okay.
Well, really... I'll do the serious bit, and then you come. I'll be the straight man, and you and you can do the fun bits. So this is Campbelltown. A little bit of background on Campbelltown while you're having a little sniff. This is on the Kintyre Peninsula. That's the kind of bit that droops down just off the coast of Glasgow. Goes back to the early 17th century for the granting of the first license to produce aqua vita. In the Victorian age, Campbelltown was known as the whisky capital of the world. That was by virtue of its location. It was well positioned to have a lot of natural resources. There was coal mine for the power. There was lots of barley around, and it was just over the water from Glasgow. So it was a very usefully situated place to be able to produce and ship whisky. Originally, it was known as Lockheed or Lockheed until the mid-19th century, when the name Campbelltown was invented, somewhat immodestly, by the local lairds, who were the Campbells. Moving forward, there at one time over 30 distilleries there, but in the early 1920s, the colliery closed, which put an end to the cheap local fuel that was able to power the distillery. Then there was the Great Depression and Prohibition. So by 1929, there was only 3 distilleries which remained open. That was Scotia, Springbank, and Reclacken. So this distillery that we're looking at now actually fell silent for a while, a couple of times actually through the years. But then in 2000, when Glenville Distillery reopened, it was reopened again. So that re-established Campbelltown as a status of whisky producing region. So onto this particular one then. So each cask is chosen for its character and exceptional maturity. Now this has been finished in a deeply charred oak. So we've got a very, very smooth single malt whisky. And it's bottled traditionally straight from the cask, no filtration. And we've got quite a subtle wood and vanilla flavour there, and quite a bit of spicy fruit, I think. This is coming out at cask strength, by the way, so it's over 54%. You may want to sip it neat. You may want to add a couple of drops of water, just see how that change. What do you think of this one, Callum?
I'm a big fan of this. So once again, we had a discussion yesterday, and Glen Scotia are releasing some amazing malts. Their double cask is great, and I believe they released a double sherry cask this year, which I haven't tried yet, but is on my list. Yeah, in terms of tasting notes, I get loads of tropical fruit on the nose, and you can just sort of when you nose it, you can just tell it's going to be rich. It's got real depth. It's got a real quality about it. And so melon is one of my big tasting notes from this, like a cantaloupe, like a white melon, and rum raisin ice cream on the nose, and then on the palate you get more of that sort of like rum and vanilla notes. With some salt in there, and so the tasting note that I can't get away from, and it's not really a tasting note, it's kind of how it makes me feel. It's like I can't get away from the word leather, but it's not, which actually now that I say that out loud it sounds a lot worse than it is. But yeah, I can't really get away from that. It's not necessarily the flavor of leather, but it kind of brings me to sitting in a big leather armchair, this whiskey. So yeah, so as I said, it's not necessarily a tasting note, but it's definitely how it's rich and yeah, it just feels a bit luxurious. It's a really lovely palate, and on the finish it's just vanilla for days. It's great.
Well, I see that Louise has said it's lovely with Christmas cake. And then David's saying caramel, mango, yeah. And then Samuel has added a little bit of water and got vanilla. And I think definitely a couple of drops is all you need initially to open it up. There's a lot of stuff going on here. I mean, one set of tasting notes that I read, and I agree with most of them, but I'll read out the words and see if that triggers anything that you're tasting. Old-fashioned and leathery aromas. Actually, that's that concurs with Callum. So I don't know whether you wrote those notes that I found, but you're spot on. And then old oak, wood smoke, dried fruits, dried citrus peel. There's your Christmas cake in there. Sea spray and old books. It has got that very kind of settling down, sit down in a library, an old-fashioned library, leather armchair. Lots of old hardback books, maybe some Burns poetry if you want to really indulge. Toffee.
I like the old books because old books could be dusty, but it's not. It's
got that well matured quality paper, almost maybe sort of parchment. Yeah, I know what that's like. I mean, back in the old days when we used to go into libraries or bookshops, you go somewhere like Foyles in Charing Cross Road, and that was just like an oasis with all these books. Or going to an antiquarian bookshop, take a flask of this and go to Hay on Wye. There you go, you got everything there. Salted nuts, toffee apples, raisins. This actually won an award not all that long ago, as it was winner of the Campbelltown category of the World Whisky Awards, and I think I can understand why. And Shauna, the nose is almost like tiramisu.
You were talking there about cask strength, and this is bottled at cask strength. So it's an interesting sort of concept, or interesting element to talk about. So most when you distill whiskey, generally it'll come up to about 80% ABV, but we don't necessarily put it in the cask at that strength after its second distillation. There will be some water added to it generally before it goes into the cask, and it will be casked at about 69 or 68%, here or thereabouts. So when you see cask strength with a lot of whiskies, it will come out at about 68% or in that ballpark, down to maybe 65. That is if it's got any age to it, it's probably quite an unreactive cask. You will lose ABV on whiskey over time. And this is coming in at 54%. Cask strength here means they've added no water to it, essentially, when after it's come out the cask, I'm assuming. Because 54%, you wouldn't necessarily go, oh, it's up in its high 60s. But it's kind of the purest expression of what they've done. They've not really added anything to it when it's come out the cask. And it's obviously been quite a reactive, or a number of reactive casks for it to drop down. And that's a good thing. That's where you get all these lovely deep and rich flavors from. If it's in an unreactive cask and the ABV doesn't do anything, you might as well just put it in a stainless steel vat, and you won't really get any extra flavors from it, which will be a bit disappointing. But yeah, no, this has obviously been in something that's reactive. It's been in something that's gonna interact with the air, interact with the wood. The ABV's dropped a little from traditional cask strength, but in exchange for that loss of ABV, you get all these amazing flavors from the oak.
It's really integrated well, hasn't it? Of course, the drop in ABV over years is what we call the angel share. Most of you have probably heard of that. That's where, due to the porosity of the oak casks in which the whiskey is being matured, a little bit is lost through evaporation, and the alcohol seeps into the wood a little bit further than the water, as it's a bit more volatile. Hence, the ABV will, over a period of time, tend to drop down slightly. In Scotland, this is kind of climate dependent. In Scotland, the angel share is about 2% a year, whereas if you go to more warmer climes, such as sort of Caribbean for maturation of rum, it can be 4 or 5 times that. So the argument would be that a rum that's aged sort of 10 years is actually the equivalent of maybe 30 to 40 years in Scotch whisky terms. But that's a whole other argument to have. But I hope you've been enjoying that. Jolyon, you've created a very a sort of evocative image there. Smells like my dad's old Mark II Jaguar interior. So
I love that.
The leather and wood, yeah, that's excellent.
And there's something to be said about your own sort of flavor lexicon as well.
Mm.
You can describe to someone what a car looks like, but you can't necessarily describe to someone what passion fruit tastes like. It's a very different thing, and you need to have those touch points, and they're so filled with memory as well that so you can, like I said, you can't necessarily place a flavor sometimes, but you go, I smelt it then, or it reminds me of home, or it reminds me of my grand's scarf or something like that. And that's probably because she washed it in, or she wore something that was lavender flavored or something. But you don't necessarily have that association with lavender. You have it with the scarf. So when you try and get that tasting note, it comes out slightly strange. So I love that Dad's Mark II Jaguar. It just
I'm sitting next to you, Jolyon, on that. I think my dad didn't have a Mark II Jag, but I know somebody who did. And there was that quintessential 1960s English car with the walnut dashboard and the picnic tables that pull down and the Colony hide, and that smell is so evocative, as you were saying, Callum. I think it's there's a whole study to be done on how we retain memory, and smells can trigger things that can be really deeply buried, and you can walk down a high street and you can get a whiff of something that can suddenly take you back to school. I remember seeing somebody a few years back washing down the outside of their steps in a sort of retail area with Jay's fluid, and of course that was what they used to use at school. So I was strangely transported back to my days at infant and junior school with this kind of evocative whiff of Jay's fluid. Happily, that doesn't appear on my tasting notes. So smell is time travel. Absolutely, they're getting very, very philosophical, almost poetic. Excellent. So let's move on a little bit. Talking of poetry, here's my cue for you, Callum. Let's have another couple of verses.
His knife see rustic labour dicht, and cut you up wi' ready slicht, trenching your gushing entrails bright, like ony ditch, and then oh, what a glorious sicht, warm, reeking, rich. Then, horn for horn, they stretch and strive, deal tack the hindmost on the drive, till the wheel, swallied kites believe, are bent like drums. The old guidman, maist like to arrive, bethank it hums.
Thank you so much for that. That's great. We're getting culture, we're getting entertainment, we're getting some lovely whiskies. So Callum's talking about the use of casks, and again, do chip in on this. The different types of oak wood that we get will have different effects on the whiskey. We mentioned that the American white oak is used a lot in bourbon. Callum explained how the rules over there, inherited from the mafia domination of the lumber industry, meant that you've got to use new oak every time, which creates a ready supply for the economically sound Scots to use to mature their whiskey.
That's a very kind way of putting it.
Well, I am half Scottish myself, so I tread a delicate path along here. But the two principal types of oak that are used are Quercus robur and Quercus alba. Those are two subspecies of oak Quercus alba is American oak, Quercus robur is European oak, and they both have different qualities. So American oak tends to impart flavors like vanilla and coconut, and it gives a sort of mellow and slightly caramelly soft effects on the taste. It tends to grow in the east of America, in some parts of Canada. It's cheaper than European oak because it grows fairly quickly, but it's also quite dense. The wood grain is very compressed, so it goes fast and hard. European oak tends to add a bit more of a sort of spicy and vanilla flavors to whiskey during the aging process. It's got a slower growth with a tighter grain, but it's also more absorbent than other oak species. So the maturation process means that the liquid will get deeper into the oak, and all other things being equal, will tend to extract more flavors. And so you can get a bit more tannin as well, so you can get a slightly sort of sharper, spicier note from a European oak. There are other sorts of oak that can be used. You've got Sicily oak, which tends to be found in parts of Europe and is very common in Ireland. Interestingly, it tends to be sourced from France for cognac and the wine industries. And then if you're going to the Far East in Japan, they tend to use perhaps Mongolian oak as well. But for the purposes of Scotch whisky, we'll tend to use, I think, mostly combinations of European and American oak. I hope you like the fact that I've put a Glenfiddich picture there, Callum.
It's appreciated.
Good, good. So, again, just briefly, we'll look at this. Again, I don't know if you'd like to talk us through some of this, Callum, but the art is a sort of combination of art and science. So if you kind of just look through this, you're trying to extract flavor, and you want to hit your your ideal line along here, which is where the distillery are looking to try and achieve a certain flavor profile over years. And new casks can be too strong, older casks can be too weak. So you really want that Goldilocks balance of it being just right. Anything you want to add about cask choice and usage?
Yeah, well, this is where the sort of master distillers come into play. Every distillery will have a master distiller. At Glenfiddich and Ailsa Bay, we have Brian Kinsman, and at Balvenie we have Sir David Stewart. And this is you can talk about blended whiskey, and then you can talk about single malt, but single malt is still blended. Single malt is still a collection of casks. It's just a collection of casks from one distillery made out of only malt. When we talk about blends, there will be, sort of numerous distilleries, and sometimes you use grain as well, which is a slightly different element. You distill grain differently. But yes, for the single malts, the master distillers are sort of the heroes of this, because they will be tasting pretty much a sample of every single batch that goes out. They will be the ones making that decision as to sort of are making that the ability for your bottle of Glenfiddich 12 in the UK taste exactly the same as the bottle of Glenfiddich 12 you buy in Vietnam in 5 years' time. There's a tremendous skill when they're dealing with so many casks. Think about the volume of bottles that go out, as you were saying, in the whiskey industry. Sort of, was it 46 bottles a second or so? When you're talking about the volume, to keep that so consistent, they've got to be playing around with these all the time, and tasting and at the same time going, right, so sort of this is kind of the batch that we've got, so we've got a bunch of really good casks for that, and that'll be the core, and then we've maybe got some really strong ones and really weak ones that we so that we can bring together, and you're looking for certain notes from them maybe, but also at the same time for every now and again to be going, what, that's really good just now, but if we leave it another 3-4 years, that'll be perfect for the 15, or if we leave it another 7-8 years, it'll be perfect for the 18 or the 21, or maybe that's just a little bit special. Let's just leave that aside. And to be able to play that sort of 3D chess in your mind to go, oh, that's, so that's great for, it's like, oh, because it would be easy to go, oh, let's just put it all into the 12, and then forget about the 15 and the 18, whatever else you still have to mature. So it's an amazing thing they do. It really is an amazing thing they do.
Great stuff. The use of the graph, of course, has tended to create flashbacks of a different sort. Louise has said she's getting Chris Whitty flashbacks with this graph, and David's asked, is the distillation rate rising? So I think this gives me a nice cue to say, well, I think the R rate is peaking now, because this is the R rate. So we move swiftly on. I hope you like that link. To Glenfiddich Grand Cru. The distillery was founded by William Grant in 1887, and currently is owned, I understand, by descendants of the Grant family. One of the kind of signature characteristics of Glenfiddich is the willingness and desire to experiment and explore and innovate. So this is what we have the pleasure of showing you this evening. It's the Glenfiddich Grand Cru. The presentation is absolutely gorgeous. If anyone wants to buy somebody a gift, that's a super. It's all about all the senses, isn't it? It's not mostly about the liquid in the bottle, but I think the anticipation and the expectation of what of how it's presented and what it comes in is also part of the process. So this is a single malt that has been finished in French cuvee casks, and these cuvee casks are obviously oak, but they are casks that were used for what was eventually going to become champagne. We can't actually call this champagne at that stage, because champagne is a two fermentation process. The bit that turns it into the fizz that we know and love takes place in the bottle, but the first fermentation will take place either in a tank or in a barrel, and these are barrels that have been used for that process, and that gives a wonderful and interesting layer of flavor in addition to what's been used, which is American oak, for the majority of the maturation process. So it's about creating these layers of flavors. And the age statement of 23 years means, of course, that the youngest component of this whiskey is 23 years old. There will be components which are even older still. So, tasting notes. It's got a lovely golden colour. I shall let you guys tell me what you're getting on this one.
I can just sit and nose that all evening. I'd be quite happy with that.
There's just so much going on in there, isn't there? So we're getting things according to the makers of apple blossom. It's definitely almost like apple pie, actually, as well.
So far be it for me to to disagree with the people at Glenfiddich, who are undoubtedly my bosses.
This is being recorded, Callum, so we may need to edit this.
just gonna cover the screen up just now. So I do get apple blossom, but for me it's more conference pears. That's my big note, and then sort of a little bit of sort of orange essence or all orange blossom notes. But there's so many things you can sort of pick out of there. But for me, I think it's down to the fact that Glenfiddich is a really interesting malt in terms of the DNA of Glenfiddich is through every single bottle of Glenfiddich that you will buy. You know, sort of those cornerstone notes of generally apple is there right the way throughout. But I think I'm a big sucker for the Glenfiddich 18. And on that, and it's interesting, the UK brand ambassador, the Scotland brand ambassador now, Mark Thompson, who lives and breathes Glenfiddich, says that Glenfiddich 18 is probably lower in his list, but I love it, and I think it's probably lower in his list because he just loves Glenfiddich so much that it's those sort of apple notes that he looks for, whereas Glenfiddich 18 has a little bit more of that pear. I think this is a little bit of that pear as well, over the apple. And I just get, it's the first thing that hits me every single time because I've drank that Glenfiddich 18. I just get pear all day.
It's very subtle. But it just, although it's subtle, it's not as in your face as some whiskies, but it lingers a long time.
If anybody's ever had sort of dessert Sauternes wine,
yes,
I get those notes, the honey, the orange, and then sort of custard or creme brulee, sort of just rolling around there.
Yeah, I get that Sauterne thing. There's a little bit of orange marmalade and sort of apricot lurking in there, which you tend to get with Sauterne as well. But there's, you keep going back to this, and this is one where you definitely benefit from holding the glass slightly at an angle and gently sort of inhaling the thing as you draw it past your nose with your mouth very slightly open, and you just get a lovely spectrum of these delicate but really nicely balanced flavors. It's a real treat to be able to share this with you guys, because it's not an inexpensive. None of these whiskies are cheap, but this one retails at well over £200 a bottle.
Yeah, this is one that is not on the list of available malts for our sample bottles. I don't think they'd. I think there's not many of these that are given out or they're delicious. I
think Jolien's. I agree with you. It's very subtle, but there's a lot going on, and with a changing taste as you leave it on the palate. And Jolien says better without water for him. I can concur with that, I think. And thanks, Sam. Diet Coke really changed it for me. Well, like we said, we're not sticklers for tradition here. Glenfiddich is an experimental brand, so if you feel like indulging in a little experiment, and you may like to try both full fat Coke and Diet Coke, because I'm sure there'll be some subtle differences between the two samples. I'm expecting some tasting notes from you, but you have to come and buy a bottle from us first. Good. Well, whilst you're hopefully enjoying that one, I think I'm going to tease you with another piece of trivia. What should we ask you? Okay. Robert Burns had fathered how many offspring by 4 different mothers?
Everybody's guessing high. They've clearly know Burns.
Okay, I'm going to count that one down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Well, clearly he was more productive than even Boris Johnson. So most of you think he actually had 12 kids, which there are various different sources, but we think that's about the right answer. So prolific is definitely the word for it. Okay, let us move on. Okay, so whilst we're hopefully still enjoying a little bit of the splendid Speyside, that is the Glenfiddich Grand Cru, treat us to the next instalment.
Is there that or his French ragout, or olio that would saw a sow, or fricassee would mak her spew, with perfect scunner, looks down with sneering, scornful view on sick a dinner. Poor devil, see him o'er his trash, as feckless as a withered rash, his spinel shank, a good whiplash, his knee a knit, though bloody flood, or field to dash, oh how unfit.
Splendid, thanks Callum. Good, okay.
Burns is designed to be poured over after 2 or 3 whiskies. This is I'm getting into it now.
Yeah, I can tell you're really getting into your stride with that. That's great, and that's poured in both spellings of the word, I think.
Yeah, he loved his whiskey as much as he loved his women, which is you know, his ode to haggis is I think 8 verses, and his ode to whiskey is 33. So that's an idea of the man.
We could have, well, maybe the next tasting we'll get you back, and you can we can do a sort of sponsored marathon, and we can do all 33 verses of the ultimate whiskey. Okay, so let's go on to our penultimate whiskey, which again I'm going to hand over to Callum for this, and in fact I'm going to give you control, Callum. Okay, you now have control of my timorous beastie, otherwise known as the mouse. So
loose.
Loose in the loose.
So yeah, so my predominant role at William Grant and Sons is brand ambassador for Ailsabay, and Ailsabay is a lot of fun. I handle the innovation brands as a whole, so anything new that isn't part of an existing range, I get to play with first. I get all the new toys, and as far as new toys go, Ailsabay is new. Ailsabay is a distillery built in 2007. Started producing whiskey in 2008. And we are unabashedly the most technological-led whiskey or whiskey distillery in Scotland. There's many reasons for this. As we've heard already, the company was founded in 1887. It's still in family hands. It's still the Grant family, and we get to take, you know, so when we decided to build a new distillery, we have 130 years of distilling experience behind us. So we get to use all that knowledge that we've gained and all the modern day technology that we didn't have access to when we built our original distilleries in the late 1800s. So hopefully, let's just see if this works. Why is that not changing?
Do you want me to do it for you? I did give you control.
Yeah, we'll have another little go and see what happens. So yeah, okay. So in 2007, we set out to build a distillery that was heavily peated, to produce a malt that was heavily peated to rival that of the traditional Islay malts. There we go.
Good man.
And we built on the west coast of Scotland, so it's the site of a former munitions factory. And also the site that was formerly the Ladyburn Distillery. Now, the Ladyburn Distillery lasted 9 years in the 60s and 70s, and was quickly mothballed. If you happen to find a bottle of Ladyburn whiskey, buy it, keep it. It's maybe one of the ones in Nichols and Perks that's valued at the higher end. And
I tell you, we get asked so many times, would you have any Ladyburn, perhaps? And a number of times I've been asked that. Sadly, no. Yeah.
And so there's a couple of reasons for building the site. One is the access to water. So the local council gave us, when we first went there in the 60s, gave us access to the local reservoir, and for every 1,000 litres of water we use, they charge us a penny, which is great. And loads of great access. So we're right on the coast. As I said, it was a former munitions factory. There is something quite wonderful about the fact that since the First World War, everything that's been built on that site is combustible and will explode. And this is Ailsa Craig, which we look out onto, so hence the name Ailsa Bay. We're based in Girvan, so this very southwest of Scotland. And this is as much as we went out to rival the Isle of Malt. So yes, and our big alternative for our person in the chat. It's very unusual for the style to be in the Lowlands, and it's the joy of being able to build something from scratch. Because if you went to Glenfiddich and tried to totally change the nature of Glenfiddich, you couldn't really do it. You know, sort of, there'd be a whole uproar. But to build something from scratch is phenomenal. It's great fun. So yeah, so Girvan Distillery on the same site as our grain distillery, which we have there. So obviously we have Grant's Whisky, for which we distill grain, and just a short walk from our Hendrick's Gin distillery. So yeah, as I said, we had 130 years distilling experience, and we didn't want to really make a copycat version of the stills that went of the malts that went before. We didn't really want to. It would be very easy for us to come down and make a Lowland style in the Lowlands, but we wanted to make something absolutely from scratch. We wanted to make something that was really our own. So we've really gone out of our way to make this malt unique. The whole distillery can essentially be ran by a single person, and they control the whole distillery process from basically a bay of computers. The software is unique to us. As we said, the fermentation equipment, you essentially make a beer. So we generally in distilleries you use any brewing equipment that comes to hand because it's not deemed as that important. But we were making something from scratch that we wanted to last for hundreds of years. So we went to Krones in Germany, who make all the brewing equipment for the very best brewers in Germany, the best brewers of German beer. And so they made all our brewing equipment for us. The stills, we made copies of our Balvenie stills. So they're all identical to the stills at Balvenie because we knew that's sort of what we wanted to base ourselves on in terms of that, you know, so we could change a lot of things with that. When you condense whiskey from that essentially from the steam that comes off the fermentation, you can do it with stainless steel condensers or copper condensers, and they both produce different flavors. We're the only distillery that has both of them in the actual still itself, so we can switch between one and the other, so we can get all these different flavors. So we actually produce 5 different styles of malt of whiskey that all blend together to become the Ailsa Bay. We've got 2 different styles of unpeated and 2 different styles of peated. 3 different styles of unpeated and 2 different styles of peated. And then in maturation, as we were talking about before, we steal some of the Hudson quarter casks. So when you're talking about the bourbon casks, they will be generally 200 to 250 litres. Hudson quarter casks are around 50 litres. And I equate this to, imagine, because they're going to be filled to about the same level, they're going to be filled to about 70, 80, 90%. So if you have a room full of people, a hall full of people, and you fill that 90% full, and you sort of shuffle about for a little bit, there's only so many people going to be able to touch the sides of that hall.
That doesn't sound like social distancing to me, Callum.
It's a poor analogy for the current time, I will give you that. But if you go to a lift and you fill that 90% full of people, everybody's going to be touching the site. And that's the same with the quarter casks. There's much more interaction with the wood. There's much more interaction with that, with basically the thing that's going to impart the flavour. And the great thing about the quarter casks are they've not been used for a great amount of time, but they're full of vanillins, or vanillins, really. And that gives us a really great, sweet essence. And every single drop of Ailsa Bay goes through these quarter casks first before they get moved into other casks. So one quick second here. Sorry, someone's just appeared at my door. One quick moment. Of course they have. So yeah, so the Ailsa quarter casks, and then we move them into for further maturation. So the quarter casks are really one of our amazing sort of key ingredients. So we combine that with cutting edge whiskey science, which sounds really geeky. It is really geeky, but as I said, we lead with that. So if you ever see a bottle of Ailsa Bay, it doesn't say it on your little labels here, but I'm not sure if this will focus in. Basically, we have a sweetness parts per million number and a peats part per million number. So the sweetness parts per million is something that is absolutely unique to us. We break down the molecular structure of the whiskey when we analyze it, and any of the molecular compounds that we know is associated with sweet flavors. Not that there's any sugar or anything in the malt, once it's distilled anyway. But these are all compounds that are brain associated with sugar. So we analyze that and put that into a parts per million number. And then peat parts per million is not something that's unique to us. There's a lot of whiskies out there now that talk about peats part per million. However, we are the only people currently doing it after distillation. And that's really, really important because you can change so much from your malted barley, which is where your peat would go in originally when it's smoked. It changes so much from there to the end product that there's really no point in trying to analyze your peat parts per million in the malt. Because if you wanted to, you could have a really peated malt and distill it in such a way that was practically unpeated at the end. So it doesn't really give the drinker a nice frame of reference for what they are drinking. Whereas with the Ailsa Bay, the idea of the range in the end will be that you can pick your sweetness parts per million, you can pick your peats part per million, and you know that the next one's going to be peatier than the last one, or less or more sweet. So we really are doing things that are unique to the industry at the moment. But yeah, I won't yabber on too long. Please try the whiskey. Please enjoy the whiskey. It is peated. We say it is the most accessible peated single malt. We are award winning in terms of our field. We were awarded the best Lowland single malt when this particular edition was released in 2018. As I said about Ladyburn, there's not so many of the original Ailsa Bays kicking about anymore. We released our first edition in 2016, I believe, and then followed it up with 1.2 in 2018. Hopefully we'll see some more down the line. The Ailsa Bay site itself is amazing. The size of it, there's 57 warehouses on site. We store whiskey for a great number of distilleries, not just ourselves. So there's about 10% of all maturing Scottish malt whiskey on site in Girvan. It's worth between 8 and 10 billion pounds to the Chancellor of the Exchequer if we were to bottle it all tomorrow, let alone what would like retail at. So the value in that area is absolutely massive. And these, as I said, 57 warehouses, I believe, and they're all filled with whiskey stacked 10 high. It's massive amounts. But anyways, please try the malt. You are going to get sort of lots of lovely vanilla notes. Oh, that's a lovely picture of me. I didn't know that was coming. Yeah, you are going to get lots of sort of sweet notes off that. But you're going to get smoke as well. But it's not the sort of West Coast Islay smoke that you kind of associate. We have specifically used peat from the northeast of Scotland, rather than using peat from Islay or other coastal areas. And that gives us campfire smoke rather than the iodine sort of the note that some people would go, oh, that smells like a hospital. This smells like your burnt out log. What's the word I'm looking for? Log fire, essentially, log burner. And yeah, you're going to get apples in there. You're going to get a touch of coconut, as there is some virgin oak in here, along with the Hudson. And yeah, you're just going to get loads and loads of that vanilla. And I'd love to know in the comments from anybody that doesn't traditionally drink peated single malt, how they feel about this. I understand peated malt isn't for everybody, but I really believe that this is a really accessible peated malt. I think it's fantastic. As far as flavour matching goes, white chocolate buttons. White chocolate buttons in Ailsa Bay are just a dream. They're brilliant.
That sounds like a well-balanced diet, Callum.
What I've lived on during lockdown.
That's great. But no, thanks for that. I find this fascinating in so many levels. The interesting thing is that I mean the balance of the sweet and the smokiness, and you don't get it all at once. For me, it tends to oscillate very gently between elements of the smokiness, but then the sweetness coming through in like the waves of the ocean. This is unusual because it's a lowland. Stereotypically, if you say lowland whiskey, you tend to think of the very kind of light floral, heathery, light honey flavors. But this is kind of strutting its stuff with this very clever peatiness. Callum, where did you source the peat from for this?
So we looked at various places. And once again, that is the joy of being able to build something from nothing. And as I said, we've got Brian Kinsman, the master distiller of Glenfiddich, who is tremendous. So yeah, he had a real play by with this. So he looked at sort of West Coast peat. He ended up with Northeast peat, so sort of Aberdeenshire area. But he did look at peat from England. He did look at peat from the islands. I know sort of Orkney was on the list. But they did look as far afield as Congo. Peat is a naturally occurring substance. We don't have any specific claim to it in Scotland. So we really went far afield, and obviously with something like the Congo or DR Congo, with something like that, you're going to have different fauna, different influences from the ground. So I'm sure there are samples out there still aging away that have this Congolese peat, which is amazing. We have enough of it at the distillery. We're a very large distillery, despite the fact we're still quite young. We produce 12 million litres a year, which I think will be good for probably 5th largest distillery in Scotland. Once Glenfiddich have their expansion up and running, which it probably is now, they'll be number 1 with Macallan, probably number 2. And then we're down in 5, which for a distillery that doesn't sort of produce that much as yet is very exciting for me, because it means we're laying down a lot of stock, we're aging a lot of stock, and we'll be continuing to produce some really amazing stuff. If anybody has tried the original Ailsa Bay, you will notice quite a difference between the original and the second iteration. This is a lot more approachable. The sweetness is dialed up. The peat is up a little bit as well, but I think that's more a balance issue. And this, we're talking about, do you drink it in, do you add a dash of water, do you add Coke or whatever? As a highball with soda water and a little squeeze of lime, this is phenomenal, and it's a whole balance behind it that leads that or lends that ability.
Thanks for that, Callum. I think one of the comments that sums up where this is aiming is from Shauna, who says she and her partner are very different in terms of taste. He hates peated whiskey. He's apparently more of a rum fan, and she loves peated whiskey, but you both like this. It's a great crossover. So I think, I really get that. I understand that. I think this is a whiskey that can open up people's kind of palates and exploration a bit more than perhaps being hit between the eyes by a very kind of tarry medicinal Lafroig or something of that sort. Okay, now we're coming to our final whiskey of the evening, and this is Eskeg. This is from Islay, and this is a limited edition. This is a 12-year-old, which was released last spring, and it drew from vintages of 2006 and 2007 hogshead, and a total of just 18 Bourbon hogsheads were combined to build this. So again, there's a lovely balance of sweetness as well as the traditional Islay smoke. I think tasting these two whiskies back to back, don't forget to have a little bit of a sip of water to recalibrate and reset your palate, because there's an overlap, but there's a difference as well. And I think it's a nice and interesting exercise this evening to have the Islay peated whiskey after the Lowland peated whiskey and see what the similarities and differences are. So I've put a map of Islay here. This is in the Inner Hebrides. It's the southernmost island of the Inner Hebrides. You can see down there. Now, this is called Port Escaig. There's no actual distillery called Port Escaig. However, you'll see from the map that the location of Port Escaig is suspiciously close to Kalila, which is one of the distilleries there. The notes on the bottle say that it is produced by an unnamed distillery in the northeast of Islay. So if you go northeast, you've really got a choice of two, Bunnahabhain or Kalila. And with the proximity to Port Escaig, what do you reckon, Cal? Where do you think this comes from?
I tell you, it's not the Frog.
No, it ain't Lefroy, that's for sure. So again, this is coming out at an interesting 46%, just under. So again, try it neat, chew it around a bit, and then maybe just add a drop or two of water and see. Particularly, I think with the peated whiskies, the water drop addition really can open things up and change the balance quite noticeably.
Salt and brine.
It's very maritime, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got, I think it's fascinating coming on the back of the Lowland whiskey. I've just literally added 2 drops of water to mine, no more. And it definitely opens up the fruitiness there, but you've got this kind of saline almost. I mean, you can imagine sitting on the shore with the sea crashing off the rocks with seaweed on the shore. This is the sort of whiskey that you could have in a flask or have it in a little atomizer, and if you've got some fresh oysters or shellfish, and just give it a little spray. It's sort of a vinaigrette dressing. Just use this, and I think that would go down really well.
David, you're going to have to explain that reference to me in the chat. This is the Uncle Albert of whiskies. So, if you get some salted chocolate or salted caramel chocolate, I would imagine with this just be a dream.
I think that's one of the suggestions I put down in the notes for things to try. I mean, you've got the obvious smoky cheeses, maybe smoked mackerel, smoked salmon, things like that. But on the sweet side, high cocoa content, salted chocolate with the sea salt there, it really works beautifully well. And you can just let the mélange melt in your mouth and forget all about the cares of the day.
Yeah.
So the tasting notes there, yeah, there's definitely that peatiness, but there is the sea breeze with a burst of lemon sherbet. I certainly get there's a little bit of there's certainly the fruitiness there, and actually it's almost a wee bit of tropical fruit, just gently, I think.
I've got a little bit of sort of like plums. Undertone, you know, it's like that little bit of underripe, you know, so when they're a little bit sour.
Yeah.
And yeah, just charcoal, real notes of charcoal as well as that sort of CBD.
Yeah, I mean, if any of you've got are using more than one glass, and that's assumption number 1, and assumption number 2, if any of you still have a little more samples that you've yet to consume, and you go back to the previous one, the Elsa Bay and see what the similarities and the differences are. I think it's quite an interesting exercise to do.
You know what? Now you go back to the Elsa, because your nose is dialed into that, the peat. You go back to the Elsa and all of a sudden all those sweet notes come through.
Yeah.
Mm.
I'm going to do that exact thing just now. Mm.
Tons and tons of coconut coming through.
Wow, that's really interesting.
That's
got
fun.
A tremendous burst of fruit from Elsa. Wonderful. I think whilst we're cogitating on that, I'm gonna ask another question. Me and my questions. So, simple one really. As we're on Islay, how many working distilleries are there today on Islay? 7, 8, 9, or 10?
Louise has done the whiskey training properly in the comments. I mean, Louise, you could have some left, but there's no harm in not having any left.
I know, Louise. Okay, I'm going to count.
Be proud.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's always you can always come and buy some more. I'm going to count this down now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. We've had a spread of answers there. The answer is 9. There are currently 9 working distilleries on Islay. Let's just get rid of that. And those are Ardbeg, Bowmore, Bruichladdich, Bunnahabhain, Killeela, Kilchoman, Lagavulin, Laphroaig, and the recent addition since a couple of years ago, 2018, Ardnahoe. That's the 9th. So there's currently 9 working distilleries, and the future looks quite rosy for Islay. And
all making very, very good malt.
Indeed, and again, once you've got the thing about the use of peat, there's such a lovely subtle variety between them all. So good stuff. Okay. I'm afraid you've got a couple more verses to go. Over to you, Callum.
But mark the rustic haggis fed, the trembling earth resounds his tread. Clap in his wally neve a blade, he'll make it whistle, and legs and arms and heeds will sned like taps o' thistle. Ye powers will mak mankind your care, and dish them out their bill o' fare. Old Scotland wants nae skinking wear that jouts in luggies, but if you wish her grateful prayer, ye her haggis.
Splendid. Thank you for that. I dropped you in that earlier on, and you've rose to the challenge like a true trooper. True trooper? True trooper. Okay. We're going to hang around for a little bit. Jolyon, you've almost gone into poetry there. You love a sweet, tropical, fruity whiskey like Middleton's, but do like a good salty whiskey like this, full of sea, less germaline than others. Yes, I agree with that. Full of power, but not overpowering. Good. David, I'm glad I'm not sitting next to you at the moment. It makes your legs go bandy. Okay, so we're gently going to kind of wind down this bit of the presentation. It's not quite all, because all you lovely people will be in receipt by email of a coupon code, which will give you £35 off a range of whiskies, which will include everything that we've seen tonight, and including a few whiskies from Balvenie and Glenfiddich as well. So keep an eye on your inboxes over the next couple of days. And we will be having a load more tastings virtually. We've got them virtually every couple of weeks now. These are wine tastings. So for those of you who like crossing over to indulge in the grape as well as the grain, we've got a lot of things coming up, but we will also be adding some further whiskey tastings over the next few months to slot in between these. So do keep in touch with us, do watch your inboxes, and thank you for coming along this evening. So what I'm going to do now is first of all to say thank you very much indeed to all of you for coming along, and a big thanks to Callum for joining us this evening and being such a good egg in reading the Robbie Burns poem and contributing some splendid insights and knowledge for the whiskey. And I'm going to stop this now and we can see each other. You can